Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Galactic Basics. Jawa, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, Todd?
Doing well, thank you. Looking forward to jumping into another episode here. Today on Galactic Basics, we're going to be looking at factions of the Old Republic. We're kind of going over that era for these first few initial episodes, and look at the key groups of power and prominence in the Old Republic time period. We'll be specifically focusing on about a 50-year period between 3681 and 3630 BBY, which is depicted in the Star Wars: The Old Republic MMO. So that's specifically what we're going to be looking at. So as we go through this, keep that in mind. Jawa, tell us a little bit of why we've kind of picked that specific time period among all of the Old Republic.
Yeah, so the reasoning is essentially threefold. One, it's what I'm personally most familiar with, so I feel best, to give out some information on it. But also, it has, frankly, the most content out of any Old Republic era, except maybe around like the KOTOR games. Like the MMO has hundreds of hours of content, then there's tie-in books, etc., etc. And it's also just a very broad era. A lot happens, so I figured it's a great era where you can do anything. So it's a very good era to focus in on, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And would you say it's fair that some of these factions might not change too drastically if you kind of go outside a little bit?
Yeah. One, the main one being the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order. They're frankly identical. Particularly how they are in like the prequels and like the Clone Wars era. It's pretty much the same. Galactic Republic filled with corruption. Jedi are warriors with lightsabers running around. Same with like the Hutts. They're all a lot of these are pretty much the same, or you could even just reskin other ones to fit different eras.
Right. Yeah. Good. So, yeah. So just kind of a little bit of a preface there that keep that in mind as we have this discussion that we are kind of sticking to that one specific era, but you can be loose with this as if you're kind of tweaking your timeline for your own campaign and whatnot. But let's get into it. So we'll start. You mentioned it a little bit there, Java, with the Galactic Republic. Of course, going to be one of the main two major powers in the galaxy throughout this era. Originally founded by the planets of the core worlds, and essentially turned into a massive government. A democratic republic, and there is some subgroups within here that we'll touch on as well. So tell us about the Galactic Republic as a faction in the universe.
Yeah, so the Galactic Republic is more or less broken down into two main categories. The first and most prominent is the political side, which is the Galactic Senate. They have all the legislative and executive powers, and they are based on Coruscant, and which is essentially the beating heart of the Republic, both politically and economically and militarily. Uh, and the Galactic Senate is composed of, uh, I think, like tens of thousands of senators and representatives from across the galaxy, with a supreme chancellor who is elected from the senators to sort of oversee the proceedings and sort of direct the political vision of the Republic as a whole. Um, and the Senate is a pretty good basis for political intrigue, which is not something we see too much in Star Wars campaigns. At least I haven't. But there's much like in the prequels, there's a lot of corruption, backstabbing, and other duplicitous acts, subterfuge. Maybe like a senator is trying to orchestrate his rise to power for whatever reason. Maybe it's for his home planet or systems, or maybe the Sith have infiltrated the Senate and are trying to destroy the Republic from within. Just sort of like in the movies. But despite wanting to be this, democratic nation built on freedom, justice, peace, and all that, there's still a lot of war in Star Wars. So they need a military, and the military is, as you would expect, it's pretty much broken down into the army and the navy. Pretty self-explanatory. Army is the ground troops, navy is all the spaceships and the fleets. Um, but the more interesting part of that is the in this era in particular, there's a Republic Special Forces division, and they're kind of like your super soldier equivalents, I suppose. They do all like the dangerous missions and anything behind enemy lines, that kind of thing. Lots of guerrilla warfare, and they're pretty prolific. Like I believe it's said in numerous places that they can go toe to toe with like squads of Sith, which is pretty formidable. So that could be a great basis for uh like a party or a group, right? A group of soldiers working together, which you could also tie into the last major sub faction of the Republic, I would say, being the Republic Strategic Information Service. It is basically the espionage and intelligence agency, less of the assassination type stuff and more of like, you know, infiltration, data gathering, spreading rumors, lies. Um, but you could have the military and the SIS working together. Maybe your players are from both, uh, and they don't have the best relationship given their differences in methods and operation. Could even throw Jedi in if you have some Jedi players. But those are kind of the main, the bulk of the Republic's main organization.
Right. Yeah, nice. Definitely two core pieces of the Republic, as you mentioned, that lots of opportunity to utilize those in a campaign setting, and whether, as you said, the players are using that for themselves, or they just become a key factor for NPCs and things like that. So great. Kind of a not directly part of the Republic itself, but definitely something that you'd mentioned. I mean, we need to touch on this faction regardless, but
Yeah.
the Jedi Order.
Yeah.
Those long-standing allies and protectors of the Galactic Republic. Basically since the inception of the Order. So they're not necessarily considered, one of these main powers in the era at this time, but definitely alongside that. So tell us, a lot of us know about the Jedi Order pretty much, but touch on a little bit more about that, and then kind of using them in a campaign as well.
Yeah. So the Jedi, I'm sure most people are familiar with. In this era, it's very much, again, like the prequels. The Jedi are essentially a religious body, which is probably attached itself a bit too close to the politics and power structure of the Republic. But they are frankly almost identical to that. The only real difference is, I would say, is that well, first, the similarity is during the Great Galactic War, which is the first part of this era, they're identical. They do all their training, they're on Coruscant in a temple. But then later, getting into the Cold War, uh, that Jedi temple is actually destroyed, much like in Order 66. But unlike that, the Jedi aren't wiped out, they're just scattered, kind of lost, and they're still well known within the Republic, but a lot of the politicians have sort of painted them as the reason for losing the war. So there's a lot of heavy baggage. Um, and so if you're playing in the early years of the Cold War in particular, you could have your Jedi players maybe looking to try to rebuild the Order, find a new home for the Order, old Jedi planets that have been long abandoned, um, which there are thousands out there throughout history of Star Wars, uh, or focus again like the exploration, maybe even dealing with the political and social baggage of the Republic now, kind of viewing them as the reason for losing, essentially.
Right. Yeah. So again, obviously, I think everyone's familiar with the Jedi Order, but definitely still prominent here in this era, and one to keep in mind is as a DM if you're creating your campaign setting and whatnot, or as a player if you're deciding how you want to align your PC with. So. All right, let's go to that other side of the coin here. This would be, we probably consider them that second major power in the Old Republic, and that's going to be, of course, the Sith, the Empire, the Sith Order, and whatnot. Definitely stark contrast to the Republic. The tyrannical Sith Empire of this era. So tell us, about the Sith and how they come up here in the Old Republic.
Yeah, so at this point in Star Wars, the Sith are essentially they built an empire. Instead of just being like sort of a religious order like the Jedi, they rule the entire thing. And they're very much so built on the beliefs that the strong should rule and the weak should die, or at the very least, be enslaved. They're very xenophobic. They only value humans and Sith purebloods. Um, and, and their nation is furthest thing from a democracy. It's straight dictatorship, um, where conflict drives everything, whether it's political, military, it doesn't matter. Everything is built around war, or at least destroying your enemies, whether it's, again, like I said, just politically, ruining their careers, or in most cases, killing them outright or worse. Um, but the Sith, again, they were originally born from the Jedi. Some dark Jedi schismed off, and thousands of years later, here we are. So this particular empire was the remnants of an old Sith empire from about, I think it's about 1,300 years before this, that got wiped out. But this one that comes back, it's very much like the Galactic Empire of the original trilogy, with the only real differences being the actual power structure has a bit more expanded to it. For one, it still has a sole Sith as its Sith Emperor, ruling above all, but then below him is essentially the rest of the Sith. They're the ruling class, the aristocracy, with like tens of thousands as opposed to just two in the movie. Um, and while the Emperor is the absolute power in the Sith Empire, he's sort of said to be immortal, all powerful, and the one who founded it 1,300 years ago. So he's lived over 1,000 years. Below him is what I would personally say is more like the real government or governing body, which is the Dark Council. It's essentially a 12-member council, the most powerful Sith lords, and they sort of rule all the day-to-day stuff, or at least the top level things, whereas the Emperor is sort of hidden away and secretive and enigmatic in his rule. And so each Dark Counselor rules over what's known as a sphere of influence. And there's ones such as technology, Sith philosophy, Imperial intelligence, so on and so forth. And ultimately, everything in the Empire falls into one of these categories, and thus ultimately answers to one of these counselors. And so, like I said, like the military, the intelligence agencies, these all fall within that. Even Sith Order, however, Sith Order, like I said, they kind of rule things, so it's a bit muddied. Um, but regardless, you still have like your Imperial admirals and generals and moffs and whatnot. So it's still very reminiscent, just more outward red lightsabers appearing. Um, and yeah, so in practice, it is still much like the Republic. There's a lot of backstabbing and constant power plays. It's just a lot more overt. And as for actually using the Sith, um, I think they're an amazing source because regardless of where you go in Star Wars, the Sith are always the main driving force for the events of Star Wars. The Sith break off from the Jedi, causing a civil war. That's it. I think like 3 or 4, maybe more major wars, all caused by Sith trying to invade. Even the movies are completely driven by the Sith's plotting and evil machination. And so, what I think is a great way to do it in this era is to choose one of these 12 spheres, either as a basis for your campaign or at least a big part of it. Because it's a good way to, excuse me, look at such a massive, entity and kind of narrow it down. Like I have done that with my current campaign where I chose one of the spheres and ultimately everything trickles down from the one dark counselor in some way or another. And so it just really helped me sort of define and tie everything in together. So I think that's a great way to use the Sith in this period of time.
Nice, awesome. Yeah, that's a excellent way to kind of think of that. Narrowing it in, so you're not maybe too overwhelmed, and that could definitely play to, as you touched on a few of those spheres, like the technology one or whatever else. Yeah, really set your campaign up to just be focused on that stuff. So, and of course, as you said, the Sith are always going to likely be behind the conflict or whatever else is going on in the campaign. So definitely an important group here to be aware of. So Sith, the Republic, we've covered our main two here in the Old Republic. But of course, there are a few others that we want to touch on. Two more that they don't hit that level of prominence or whatnot as these two, but still pretty significant here, being the Mandalorian clans and then the Hutt cartel. So touch on these two as they're definitely, people are going to know of these, and they're pretty significant, and just tell us about them in this period, and then utilizing them as well, DM or player.
Yeah, so starting with the Mandalorians, they're, very typical how we think of them, like Boba Fett, Jango Fett, or the Mandalorian, as in the show. They wear the armor, strict code of honor and ethics, and they have a certain way of conducting themselves nobly, but they're also very much all focused on combat and warfare. Um, and they sort of believe that personal and cultural development can only be achieved through constant challenge and confrontation. So it's a lot of conflict, but not necessarily, like, you're not really going to find much of the backstabbing like you will with the Sith or even the Jedi. But in this period in particular, they're large nomadic clans, and in the first war of this period, they kind of got manipulated uh, into one, reassembling into like one bigger entity, but essentially into blockading hyperspace routes and raiding them, Republic controlled ones, that is, uh, which kind of made it so that the Republic didn't get their chance to win the war when things were going well for them. And then later on, after the war ends, they kind of discover that the Sith manipulated them, and it kind of causes a schism in the Mandalorians. Some are like, well, forget the Empire, we want to be Republic, and the others are like, no, we're going to stick with the Sith. So there's that, which could be something you play into if your players are very Mandalorian focused or just interested in that kind of thing. Um, Ultimately, the Sith side do win, but they're a lot less trusting of the Sith. Uh, but overall, they are, I think, a great way to sort of mix things up because they're not very black and white. The Jedi, they kind of try to be good. The Sith are generally evil. But the Mandalorians are neither. They're kind of just, they stick to their code. They're honorable, but they do some messed up things. And they are also glory seekers. You could maybe base a campaign on some Mandalorian upstart who basically is trying to reunite the clans. Maybe it's another schism, like I mentioned, and kind of go on a galaxy-wide crusade like they did 300 years ago. There's a lot you could do and get very creative with them, regardless of era. Really, this doesn't even necessarily have to apply to here. You could take any time period you want.
Yeah, absolutely. We just did our episode or two ago on our podcast, we did kind of focus on the Mandalorians more as an aspect of like their culture and whatnot, and definitely a big group to. There's so much there that you can utilize. So in this sense of kind of where they sit as a faction or a group within an era, but then also, as you said, as you dive into it and get into the weeds of who they are as a culture, if you will, definitely lots there. So yeah, good stuff there. The next, other big one would be the Hutt Cartel. I think you said at the top of the episode that, they're pretty similar across the board, era to era, but touch on some specifics here for the Hutts in the Old Republic, and then how they can come into play.
Yeah, so like Todd mentioned, they are very similar to how they are in the movies. Although the movies sort of just focus on like Jabba and whatnot, and less on the cartel as a whole. But essentially, they're what you might almost consider like the third super power, or like the little brother of the group. They are strong and they control large swaths of space, and they have for tens of thousands of years, and they continue to even during the era of the Galactic Empire, which is kind of unheard of. Palpatine's not a very sharing type of person. So they're a criminal organization, and they have their hands in anything and everything, whether it's illegal, especially illegal, as that usually makes more money, or legitimate. There's tons of legitimate Hutt businesses, as uncommon as that might sound for them. But they sort of blur the line. They deal with the Republic and the Empire and everyone else, but they will never align with anyone, at least not openly. I forget the exact quote, but essentially one of their main mottos is about a strong belief of profit in neutrality. So they will never openly ally, but secretly they have allied with everyone and everything. There's just like the Sith and the Republic, tons of power plays. Like certain Hutt crime lords are trying to, screw over other ones or get them killed, absorb their power and their finances, especially. They're very money driven. That's really all they care about is money. But so the Hutts are really an amazing basis for whether it's a campaign or some adventures or just character backgrounds, because realistically anyone and everything can have dealings with them. Whether you're a Jedi, a Sith, smuggler, soldiers, whatever, politicians even. If you can name it, and they can probably be associated with them in some way. And I personally have used this in multiple campaigns. I've had sort of some small dealings in one where they were more of like, pro-Republic band of adventurers, essentially. Another where they were bounty hunters working for the Hutts, or at least closely associated with them. And the one I'm currently running, at this point, they're smuggling for one of the more powerful Hutts, and they're kind of getting intertwined with the Hutts and their dealings and all these sort of things. But you could really do, anything with them. It's such a open or blank canvas. I highly recommend at least doing something with them if you are in this era.
Yeah, absolutely. Following your examples as well. I've got one of my campaigns is absolutely centered around a Hutt. A previous campaign I played in, definitely dealt with Hutts. A current campaign I'm playing in, the Hunted one, that's on Tuesdays, we're dealing with Hutts. So absolutely, they're just such an easy group to throw into any campaign. And whether they're the focus or not, as you said, they're probably gonna have their hands in things a little bit in one way or another. So it's a great way just to kind of help stir things up and whatnot. So yeah, definitely Hutts are another one to make note of for sure. So a few other things. So that's definitely the core here that we want to touch on. There's obviously going to be lots of other groups. But those are your big ones there. But there's plenty of other factions. Not even more mentioned than just their name, but Jawa, tell us a few of these other groups that might just be really, if anything, worthwhile just to know the name of the faction, so that as DM out there or even as a player, uh, you have that name, maybe in the back of your head when you're putting things together, and know that they have a little bit significance in the Old Republic.
Yeah, so sort of, continuing off with the underworld theme from the Hutts, some other more criminally focused organizations include the Black Sun, who at this point in Star Wars, they've just only recently been founded. I think like the year the Cold War begins. So depending on what it is, it could be like only a couple years old. But they're rising on Coruscant, and they quite literally exploded onto the scene in a series of like horrific bombings and a basically terrorist act, just murdering people all over Coruscant. And at least at this point, they just seem like psychopaths who want to kill everything. But for people more familiar with Star Wars, they do. By the time of the original trilogy, I'm pretty sure they're basically like bigger than the Hutts. So
Yeah.
there's a lot there. But another one is the Exchange, and I know Todd, you mentioned that the hunted campaign you're playing in is dealing with them.
Yep, and yeah, big thing, big rivals to the Hutts, so that's another one that's come up.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to say is that at this point, the Exchange, they're pretty big. They're basically the second largest gang in the galaxy. And they're kind of encroaching on Hutt territory to the point where they're on planets like Nar Shaddaa, which is basically the most important planet in Hutt space. And they're trying to take over the planet, and the Hutts and them are very much fighting for control of the spice trade overall. So, there's a lot of things you could do there. Maybe not base a campaign around the Exchange, but maybe you could do at least a big part of it based on that dynamic and this power struggle, especially if you're doing more like a underworld type campaign. But a lot of these factions, these smaller ones, are great to supplement the other one. Like another one is the Geno Haradan, which I believe they originally show up in the KOTOR games, and they're kind of ambiguous at that point. By this point, they're essentially a secretive agency of assassins slash bounty hunters who are trying to manipulate galactic events to make a better galaxy, at least what they consider better. And they're sort of acting like the secret police for the Republic, to the point where I don't think anyone in the Republic but like the Chancellor is ever made aware of them. Uh, so they're kind of that could be a cool thing if you maybe get later into a campaign, or you want to do some conspiracy theory stuff, like tying again back into like the Galactic Senate and whatnot. That could be a great way to do it. Or more on the Imperial side, there's one of the more well-known species and other governments is the Chiss Ascendancy. Known for Thrawn and all those Timothy Zahn novels and whatnot. At this point, they're basically, the galaxy doesn't know about them. I don't think that ever changes throughout Star Wars. Deep within the unknown regions, though. But at this point, they bumped into the Sith Empire, and there's no details on how this happened, but they somehow managed to become military allies with them, which, especially for the Sith of this period, that's like unheard of. They sort of, if you weren't human, and even then, they generally just conquer and enslave you. So you could play up maybe the struggles or trying to maintain that alliance, right? Because I assume it would be tenuous. And there's plenty of others organizations too. Circa Corporation, for example, basically money, very grubby megacorp. They deal with anyone and everyone. They got their hands in everything, and they just want money by any means. There's there's just so many. Even like a more Sith focused campaign, there's a group known as the Dreadmasters. They're basically a group of powerful Sith lords who go rogue and try to carve out their own empire. Get into some of the more eldritchy stuff. You can go with the Gree Enclave, basically uh, weird aliens from beyond the galaxy. You know, there are so many factions which you can find so much information on online if you just do a deep dive on Wikipedia even.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, again, so much out there, and the few we touched on, I think, not that they have any major significant importance over some of these other ones that we haven't mentioned, but maybe some of them a little bit more recognizable. But yeah, I think that kind of leads right into a little bit of our conclusion here. Is utilizing is hopefully this is enough of a springboard for you DMs and players out there to then go to those sources of information, such as the Wikipedia and anything else, looking specifically at the Old Republic resources. And if you want to get narrowed into some of these lesser factions, to either be a part of them as a player or just kind of really have a plot line, a storyline in your campaign, run with them. Definitely lots there. Any other final thoughts, Jawa, on this topic?
Yeah, just sort of how you mentioned, like using Old Republic resources. I've done a lot of research for my own games, and what I've found to be the most useful is, obviously there's Wikipedia. That's the sort of classic go-to, but there's also some Old Republic wikis, which you can find some more obscure stuff on. But other than that, I think the most useful is obviously the MMO. But if you don't want to play that because it would take a lot of time, you can always go on YouTube, and there are channels which have all the cutscenes uploaded and like every different dialogue option. So, like, say you want to look up Nar Shaddaa, right? You could just look up Swotor Nar Shaddaa. You can look up everything. That's something I've done just to sort of refresh the memory. But the best resource, in my opinion, is the Star Wars: The Old Republic Encyclopedia. It's basically an in-universe ish perspective on this era, and it covers all of this and like 10 times, 100 times more than anything we've talked about. Like it's great, and yeah, if you look into any of these, if you're interested, it could be a great resource to help you find whatever info you might be looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of that we've touched on before too. Even looking at, regardless of the system that you're using for your game, your campaign, look at other systems for information. Some of the old ones. I think it was technically Saga Edition had the Old Republic out there. And that's a great, again, a lot of the kind of lore information it carries across each of these, but they might present it a little bit differently or whatnot. So again, plenty of great resources out there, and that's the next step. Hopefully after this is once we have this foundation there to continue on. So awesome. All right, so next episode, we're going to continue with the Old Republic here and get into the regions and then some of the systems, planets within that. Just kind of talk about the core regions of the era and how they factor into things in the Old Republic, what's contained in those. Whether there's these factions that we just talked about, if they're focused in one region or the other, things like that. So that's what we'll get into next time in a couple weeks. But with that being said, do we thank everyone out there who's enjoyed these videos so far? Let us know if you have any questions or suggestions on future topics for this series. And thank you to all of our followers and listeners. Make sure to check us out, dungeonjedimasters.com, for links to all of our content. And we will see you next time. May the Force be with you.
The Force be with you.